You enter an elevator, and standing there appropriately, physically distanced, is another individual. You nod hello to each other and push the buttons for the floors to which you are each headed. As the elevator door closes and begins its journey, your elevator buddy asks, "I see that you're wearing a Jewish star. I've always wondered, what is Judaism all about, anyway?" Ready, set, go. You now have 12 floors to answer. So what is your elevator speech? Perhaps you'd respond, "Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad." That would make sense. After all, the Shema is the watchword of our faith. You could say it all begins and ends with recognizing and acknowledging God's oneness in which we and all creation are united. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Or perhaps you would focus on the idea of Tselem Elohim, that Judaism's fundamental message is that we are each divine beings, each created in God's image. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Or perhaps you could quickly speak about chosenness, our role as Jews to be messengers of the unique values and ethics of Torah and its gifts to humankind. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. You might talk about our unique partnership with God, established at Mount Sinai, where God gave us the Torah, obligating us to fulfill mitzvot, through which we will bring the Messiah. Although if that is your elevator speech, likely you're not sitting in on this particular Rosh Hashanah observance. And of course, there is the remarkable and revolutionary elevator speech of Rabbi Hillel, of which I spoke last night. A speech that makes humanity rather than God the center of Jewish concern. What is hateful to you, do not do to anyone else. The rest is commentary, he said. Go and learn it. My elevator speech? Well, it comes from the Haggadah. B'chol dor vador chayav adam lirot et atzmo k'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In each generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they were the ones who had left Egypt. To my way of thinking, in order to truly understand what it means to be Jewish, you must understand the meaning of this teaching. Not just intellectually, but b'chol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your being. For me, this passage expresses what is central to Jewish faith, at the core of Jewish ethics and values and ritual. That is, empathy for our fellow human beings. In particular, empathy for those struggling to free themselves from whatever is enslaving them physically, mentally, and or spiritually. This passage from our Passover observance reminds us that rather than putting someone in their place, and hasn't there been an awful lot of that lately, our particular Jewish obligation is to stand in their place, to see the world from their perspective, in order to understand their point of view. That is, I think, the end result of the humanity first, God second theology, of which I spoke about last night. If you missed it, by the way, I'm sure you can catch it in a YouTube rerun. Empathy, as the author and researcher Peter Bazalgett defines it in his wonderful book, The Empathy Instinct, is the ability to understand and share in another person's feelings and experiences, and respond in an appropriate way. As Bazalgett reveals, the empathy instinct is hardwired into us. That's, after all, what makes it an instinct. As social animals, empathy is essential to our survival. Through empathy, we establish human connection, garner support, and create community. All essential and all important and all very wonderful. But as Paul Harvey used to say, here's the rest of the story. Our empathy also has wired-in boundaries. As brain research has shown in recent years, our empathy is primarily reserved for those we perceive to be most like us. When we say, for instance, someone is a member of the tribe, that really means something. You know about bageling, don't you? It's a Jewish empathy practice. Bageling involves, as an example, standing in a crowded place. I'm sure you all remember those days, crowded places, and calling out in a voice a little louder than necessary a Yiddish word in order to see whose ears perk up. It's about creating connection with a fellow member of the tribe. Well, experiments testing the nature of the empathy instinct have presented a group of observers with an individual who has suffered a significant tragedy. In one instance, the individual's backstory is depicted as similar to that of the observers. And in another, the backstory is completely different. Each group is asked about their empathy for the tragedy suffered by the individual they have been observing. Results show that there is a distinct difference in the empathy expressed. There is much greater empathy among those who see themselves as similar to the one who has suffered the tragedy. Our empathy wanes when we see others as not us. This kind of primal empathy is certainly understandable. For our ancient ancestors, it was necessary for defense of the tribe. You had to be able to discern quickly and decisively who was in and who was out. Survival of the group could depend on it. Sadly, human history is replete with examples where empathic tribalism has been exploited as a way to set one group against another. This is the dark side of empathy. It is easily manipulated for the purpose of gaining or maintaining power. We know this all too well. We have been its victims too many times in our history. So it greatly distresses me to see this tribalism being exploited now to create anger and fear and suspicion and division in our country. This has never turned out well for us, never turned out well for the Jewish community. And indeed, we have seen a significant escalation in both the number and intensity of anti-Semitic acts in recent years. It is simply not a coincidence when there is a continual stream of messaging declaring, they are not us. They are going to destroy us. They are going to threaten your safety. They hate this country. They are responsible for the virus. Fear them. Hate them. Fight them. Root them out. Ultimately, it is of no consequence whether the particular messaging is about us or not. The tribal brain does not distinguish. If you are not us, then you are a threat to us. And when you see yourself as the victim or the potential victim of another, it is impossible to have any empathy for them. Impossible. Primatologist Franz de Waal has noted that we've evolved to hate our enemies, to ignore people we barely know, and to distrust anybody who doesn't look like us. Even if we are largely cooperative within our communities, we become almost a different animal in our treatment of strangers. It is ironic, isn't it, to say that the root of racism, both individually and systemically, lies in the wiring of our empathic brain. But this is by no means a hopeless tale of woe. Old wiring can be replaced. In response to the tragic events of this summer, many have been involved in a rewiring project, digging deep within themselves in order to recognize and to better understand their own inherent biases. Many are, thank God, looking with a critical eye at their own empathic wiring, their natural tendencies to favor those who they see as like us, and to avoid those perceived as other. So how do we develop empathy for those we see as the strangers among us? How do we broaden our perspectives and widen the boundaries of our empathic tent? A great deal of thought and energy and research has gone into finding an answer. And the long summative answer can be found in books like Basil Goetz's Empathy Instinct, where he reviews hundreds and hundreds of case studies and experiments. But the short answer is outlined by scholar and speaker Teresa Weissman, who identifies 4 factors necessary to broaden our empathic instincts. The first is perspective taking. That is standing in another's shoes and seeing the world the way they see it. Second is remaining non-judgmental of another's perspective. Third is understanding their feelings. And fourth is reflecting back that understanding of their worldview. Now, what is notable to me as I take in Weissman's steps is that here is another great Jewish elevator speech. Weissman's empathy formula is not really so different than my elevator speech about seeing ourselves as the ones who were enslaved in Egypt. It is indeed remarkable to me that contemporary research confirms what the architects of our tradition implicitly understood about human nature thousands of years ago, an understanding that was canonized in our sacred texts. Author and scholar Micha Goodman argues that empathy is a central thread running through the biblical narrative and later rabbinic commentaries. He understands that a central purpose of our texts is to help us overcome the empathy paradox, which I have been describing. That paradox is that those who need it most receive it least because they are not us. Goodman takes note of the curious way in which we tell our story. He points out that we actually only tell half of our story. We were slaves. We never talk about the other half, that we overcame Pharaoh, that we were chosen by God, that we conquered the promised land and established our own nation. We won. We won. Why don't we tell that part of the story? Instead, we were slaves. How depressing, right? Why is that? Well, Goodman argues it is all about broadening our empathy instinct. When we link our story to that of the stranger, when we stand in their shoes and see the world as they see it, they start to become us. That is why more than any other command in the Torah, we are told we must care for the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. Why? Because we were strangers in the land of Egypt. We were the orphan, the widow, and the stranger. We plead at this season, Shema Kolenu. Hear our voice, God. V'rachem aleinu, be compassionate and have mercy on us. And yet we too often put our hands over our ears and refuse to hear the voices of those pleading with us for our compassion and our mercy. They are not us. They are too dangerous, and so I won't listen. How vital is it in this incredibly difficult moment that we hear the voice of our tradition calling upon us to broaden our empathy instinct? 2,000 years ago, Rabbis Hillel and Shammai were in continual disagreement with each other. They never saw eye to eye about Jewish law, about anything. Their arguments were often quite heated. No doubt they wanted to put their hands over their ears and stop listening more than once. Reading of their disagreements, we might think, Perhaps they hated each other. Maybe they avoided each other. Perhaps in the privacy of their homes, they demeaned each other. Certainly they had no empathy for each other, did they? Well, actually, they did. We learn from those same sources that the families of Hillel and Shammai married each other. Despite their often vehement public disagreements, they maintained a personal relationship. And while they may have strongly disagreed regarding the laws of kashrut, still they shared meals at each other's tables, a symbol that their relationship, one human being to another, was so much more significant than their disputes. They likely understood that as they strove to listen deeply to each other's competing arguments, they became stronger and smarter and wiser. And as they strove to understand each other's perspectives, they surely became more understanding, caring, and compassionate. Because of their inherent empathy for each other, their ongoing debate is characterized by the Talmud as a machloket l'shem shamayim, a dispute in the name of heaven. And of their teachings and opinions, the Talmud teaches, Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim hen. Both are the words of the living God. Can't we do the same? We have to do the same. The task we are called to during these days is to envision the world we want to create. And that necessarily begins by first looking inward, recognizing how we are wired, and making the adjustments necessary to broaden our own empathic perspectives. The reality is that most every Jewish elevator speech passed down through the generations is fundamentally about the broadening of our empathy instincts, whether it be Shema, pay attention, or Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, as we'll read on Yom Kippur, or what is hateful to you, do not do to another, or we are each obligated to see ourselves as the ones enslaved in Egypt. Each pushes us toward broader empathy. Perhaps on this day, as we seek a path to move forward in these very troubled times, it is another of Hillel's elevator speeches that we should take to heart. Actually, for someone who knew nothing of elevators, he was really, really good at creating elevator speeches for them. Hillel said, "B'makom she'en anashim, hishtadel lihiyot ish." In a place where no one is acting human, be human. Be human. And as Rabbi Hillel would conclude, the rest is commentary. Go and learn it. L'shana tova and Shabbat Shalom.